Thank you for joining us for another in our virtual workshop series for Works in Progress here at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center. It's my very great pleasure to see you all here. Before we begin, let me just take a minute and tell you a little bit about the Deason Center and about this series. The Deason Center is a criminal justice reform center at the SMU Dedman School of Law. And the Deason Center focuses on three areas, predominantly public defense, really from beginning to end, prosecution with a focus on prosecutorial charging discretion, how prosecutors make their charging decisions when they make them and why they make them, and STAR criminal justice communities, which is the way we refer to small, tribal, and rural criminal justice communities. Today, it's particularly appropriate, therefore, that we have Maybell Romero, who has written and thought about all of these things, joining us today for our workshop on her work in progress, Lowball Public Defense. Maybell is currently an associate professor at the NIU Law School and is moving this fall to Tulane, where she'll be the Felder-Fayard Associate Professor of Law. Tulane is, of course, an institution near and dear to my own heart, as well as I think I see Kimberly Simmons here. And some other folks. And so I know she's going to be a great success there as well. I'm not going to spend too much more time with introductions. I do want to let folks know how the hour or so we have is going to go. Maybell will make her presentation and we'll let her go uninterrupted. When she stops, I will moderate, taking questions and opening it up for conversation. The presentation is being streamed live on Facebook. It will be recorded, posted on our YouTube channel, and a transcript will also be made available for anyone who might want it. Usually that's our presenters want it for sure, for ideas for their papers. But in case anyone's interested, those resources will be available. So with that, Maybell, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Pam. And again, I wanted to give my thank yous to the Deason Center, and especially many thank yous for a lot of the work that the center does with regard to rural criminal justice reform. I've had the chance to work with the center over the past few years, and the work that you all do there is amazing. So I'm really grateful to have the chance to be invited and to be able to talk to you all through the center and essentially with its sponsorship today. So the paper that I'm presenting to you is at this point it's very much a work in progress. It is I like to say a very drafty draft at this point, and it is currently provisionally entitled Lowball Defense. And really what you see is that scholars and policymakers have really started to focus on the deleterious effects of the privatization of different functions in the criminal adjudicative system and the criminal legal system as a whole. And this is an exciting thing and a very necessary thing. And a lot of attention has been paid to privatized police forces, privatized prisons, I'd say even privatized prosecutors. I've written a paper about that before. That was my first article that I ever wrote. But, I think to some extent what you see getting lost is the role of the privatized public defender, and especially the rural public defender, who I think gets lost in the shuffle here. And what I intend this article to do is look specifically at the public defender in the rural context and the specific sorts of ethical conundrums that arise when local governments like counties and cities and towns decide to privatize their public defense services through the use of competitive bidding. So what I'm going to be looking at in this particular paper is a specific case I want to track out of northern Utah in particular, but I'll also be looking at some of the ACLU litigation that's been coming out of Nevada with regard to this, and as well as a few different examples of public defender contracts throughout the country. But really what I want to do is talk about the sorts of specific perverse incentives that rural public defenders face and burden under when their services are procured by way of competitive bidding, but also, throw it out to you all after the presentation to figure out, okay, is this the right focus I'm looking at, or what other considerations should I be taking into account here? So really, what I want to start with is giving you a tale of two separate cases. And I want to take you back to the summer of 1973, actually, upstate New York. And we're talking about two attorneys here, two criminal defense attorneys, Frank Armony and Frank Belge, both in Onondaga County, who were appointed to represent a man named Robert Garrow back in 1973. And Robert Garrow was a Syracuse man who was accused of murdering an 18-year-old college student while camping in the Adirondacks. So while they were preparing for trial, Armony and Belge, they learned that their client Garrow had actually killed a number of other teenagers as well. And Garrow revealed the locations of two separate bodies of two young women, Alicia Hauk and Susan Petz, to his attorneys while they're prepping for trial and everything. And this information was so specific and so accurate that these two attorneys, Armini and Belgi, actually went out into sort of the foothills around Syracuse and out in the Adirondacks in their Sunday best, trying to figure out, okay, is he telling us the truth? And using this information, they actually found these bodies. And, this is sort of an unusual step for defense attorneys, honestly, to go and look into the veracity of the claims of their client, with regard to their guilt or innocence. And I'm not necessarily going to be touching that decision-making process here. But it's really interesting that they ended up, verifying this and finding these bodies. And then, of course, keeping this very important secret, keeping their client confidences with regard to actually knowing where these bodies were located. So, one of these young women's fathers actually shows up to their office asking, well, do you know what happened to my daughter? And of course, they keep their client's confidence and they say, no, we don't know anything about her whereabouts. We refuse to divulge information. This was shared with us in confidence. Of course, they don't say that to the dad, but this is the thought process that they go through. So what you see is that these attorneys attempt to use this information to strike a plea deal with the prosecutor. In exchange for a promise not to pursue the death penalty against their client, Garrow, Armini offered information that could be used to locate the bodies of the missing young women. So, of course, the prosecutor, as you can imagine prosecutors would be, was irate. And later, when the larger community finds out that these two defense attorneys actually knew where the bodies were, even before trial, the community was also extremely angry, extremely irate. What you see is that both of these attorneys, not only do they face much derision, but also threats of violence, property destruction. Their families are threatened. They actually have to move them out of town to make sure that they stay safe. Their private practices fail because of all of this derision from the wider community. But both attorneys over time become renowned throughout the country amongst lawyers and scholars who study professional responsibility throughout the United States for their devoted representation to a less than sympathetic, if not outright infamous client. And their sort of really stubborn adherence to not disclosing this information that was given to them, that was confidential and privileged in the course of representing this person. So in the years since that case, this has actually become a really important case in sort of the PR, professional responsibility canon, and is now widely known as the buried bodies case. Contrast this with a different case from last year, nearly 50 years later. An attorney in Cache County, Utah, whose name is Shannon Demler, was faced with representing a client in a very similar situation. A 5-year-old girl, Lizzie Shelley, went missing, and by the 5th day of her absence, what you saw is that there were residents of Cache County who were mounting searches for her everywhere: backyards, fields, ditches, forests, and the like. And suspicion started to mount against her uncle, Alex Whipple, during those days, because he was the last person to have seen her alive, or just to have seen her, period. And the local prosecution agency, the Cache County Attorney's Office, ended up filing charges against Whipple related to her disappearance. And less than 2 hours later, her body is found, about a quarter of a mile away from her home. No one had thought of actually looking so close to home. And police act on information secured from Whipple by Whipple's attorney, Shannon Demler. So he ends up getting appointed to represent Whipple, and within 2 hours, actually cuts a deal with the Cache County Attorney's Office, securing essentially his life, making sure the death penalty is off the table, but already divulging all this information, and making sure that this gets resolved really quickly. So what you see is, following afterward is really interesting, I think, because Shannon Demler, this public defender in Northern Utah, ends up getting all kinds of laudatory treatment from every corner you can think of. You see the prosecutors coming out and praising him in the media. You see police coming out and praising him in the media. You see larger media outlets coming up from Salt Lake City to interview him because he's such a good person and a good community member. As Demler himself explained, he ended up wanting to resolve this quickly because he said, I think at some point in time, it just needed to stop. The waste of resources and everything needed to stop. So within a day of having his client admit to murdering and sexually assaulting his niece, he's already appearing on the local news, talking about his client's state of mind, talking about how his client is sorry, feels guilty, is remorseful, might have some mental health issues. And so he's divulging all this really sensitive information about his client to the news media that could actually be used to potentially mount an affirmative defense, but doesn't actually follow through on it, so much as using it to grandstand. And what you see is that I'm really troubled by sharing all this information just 2 hours after his client is charged and after he's been appointed. And when he's been pressed in the media as to why he did this so rapidly, he says, look, Whipple was never getting out of prison. It was obvious that my client was going to spend his life in prison. And, I really wanted to do what was best for the rest of the family and for the community. Now, I don't really think that this is a consideration that defense attorneys should be making. What's good for the community rather than their client. But for his part in convincing his client to divulge the location of Lizzie's body, Demler was lauded. He got more business. He was profiled in his local newspapers being Resident of the Year. And you'd even see members of the public leaving positive reviews for him on Google and Yelp with regard to his law practice, even though they'd never even met the guy. In praise of his service that he'd rendered to the community by revealing the information he received from his client rather than keeping it confidential. So I really think that Demler's handling of this case stands in sharp contrast to the representation that's offered to Garrow by Belgian Armony. And rather than keeping his client's confidences, what you see is Demler orchestrated this quick deal within 2 hours of his client getting charged. And rather than taking the time to seriously consider possible defenses or anything like that could have been available to his client, Demler resolved the case quickly and built for himself a good reputation in the local community and generated greater press for himself. So what's really interesting is that here, I think a lot of the pressure that he feels to build this better relationship with the community, to get this sort of good press, comes from the fact that rather than being a full-time public defender, rather than actually coming from a full-time public defender's office, rather than actually coming from a larger office where perhaps he has multiple people who have his back, he's actually been appointed to represent people through use of a competitive bidding system. This is how Demler was hired. And under this competitive bidding system, lots of rural public defenders especially feel a lot of pressure not to rock the boat, to not necessarily represent their clients as zealously as they should, to not necessarily spend the sorts of resources that they should when it comes to investigation and when it comes to hiring expert witnesses. And this is something that I find especially troubling, especially for any rural defendants out there facing this particular sort of criminal legal system out in the rural reaches of the country where a lot of it is privatized. So, as I'm sure lots of you already know, Gideon versus Wainwright holds that all criminal defendants, including the indigent, are entitled to counsel to represent them in their criminal cases. So what you see is that Gideon becomes this origin of this huge, a paper that I'm citing, describes it as this, vast decentralized criminal justice bureaucracy. So, Gideon establishes this need for public defenders and for, supplying those public defenders, but never establishes any parameters for delivery of those services, apart from maybe some of those minimal standards of, competence set forth in Strickland versus Washington. And what you see is that lots of larger cities and counties, they supply public defender services through an office full of full-time public defenders. And, if you look at LA County, you see about 1,100 attorneys in their public defender's office. You look at the public defender service in the District of Columbia or the Bronx defenders, and they both have about 300 attorneys. And all of these offices are devoted entirely to public defense. They get to have this sort of undivided time in that is what they're devoted to. This is all they do, just public defense work. So, it's interesting because when you have these full-time offices, no matter the size, these systems, they don't have their loyalties divided by way of, resources or time or anything like that. But, when we're talking about any public defender system, they're all funded directly or indirectly by the government somehow. And there are really important differences in the level of government that supplies that financing and what, that delivery of services ends up looking like. So, I think that there are these two other models of public defense delivery that oftentimes we don't end up looking at quite enough. There's an assigned counsel model, and the one that I'm really focusing on is this contract system in this paper in particular. And in this contract system, a jurisdiction, it's usually a state or one of its political subdivisions like counties, cities, or towns, will contract with attorneys to provide public defense services rather than hiring them directly into a dedicated public defender system. And I'm sorry if you can hear my Boston Terrier barking in the background. So, it's sort of interesting because this system has been noted for, potentially creating conflicts of interest and everything. But, there are a lot of counties and cities that use this contract system as their primary means of providing indigent defense services. And I think when we're talking about something like any legal service, be it a prosecution service or a public defender service, using this sort of contracting out competitive bidding system, especially when you're talking about people who are doing these jobs on a part-time basis, is especially problematic. Providing legal services isn't the same as building a road or providing, trash, disposal or something like that. You don't necessarily have the same metrics to determine, okay, when are you getting good legal services versus when are you constructing this, a specific road, and is it meeting these sorts of like construction standards or something like that? So I really do cast doubt on using competitive bidding as a way to really secure any sort of, public legal services at all, just period. But again, returning to talking about, the rural chunks of the country. There are these spatial inequities that we need to deal with when we're looking at delivery of public defender services in particular. And a number of my colleagues have done some amazing work in this regard already. The Deason Center has done a lot of work on this. Wonderful colleagues of mine like Lisa Pruitt, I think Hannah Haxgard's on the line even, have looked at this general issue of this rural legal desert. What exactly do we do about this? And I really like this analogy with regard to, the American public defense system being like this patchwork quilt that's really full of moth-ridden holes that I've seen from Jeffrey Burkhart and David Lamb. They've got this really great paper called Toes Poke Through and Knees Shiver, Mapping Public Defense in America. And what you see is that in rural places, that gets even thinner and even more threadbare and patchier. And this is something that is, really troubling to me in that, again, we don't have good standards for delivery of services across the board. And I think what you see in the rural reaches of the country is that oftentimes there just isn't the tax base to hire a full-time public defender. There isn't really the demand or the need to hire someone full-time. So how exactly do we fill the need for these services? And I think that's why you see, this public defender sort of contract system, it's really taken off, at least, especially since the early 80s, when a lot of devolution of responsibility to local government really started becoming fashionable in the first place. So, again, you see larger cities, they have enough criminal cases and criminal defendants such that dedicated public defenders offices, they just make sense. But in smaller jurisdictions, it's not going to make sense to hire multiple, let alone one full-time defense attorney to serve as a public defender. So, rather than saying, you should never be allowed to do this, small towns, rural counties or anything. What I'm really trying to do, at least in drafting this paper and highlighting some of the problems that arise from using this system, is at least bring these problems to everyone's general cognizance and understanding, rather than saying categorically, no, you should never do this. But, I do think that these are issues that we should be aware of. And, being more aware of them, I think, is really helpful in trying to figure out how do we make this system better. So I want to make that at least clear before I start getting into talking about the rest of the paper. And this article is actually the second in a series examining the potential personal and institutional motivations potentially driving public defender behavior and performance under a competitive bidding system. And it uses similar definitions, or at least I intend that it will, to that found in its 2017 companion, Profit-Driven Prosecution and the Competitive Bidding Process. And what you see is that piece focused exclusively on cities and counties and other political subdivisions below the state level that relied on contracting out and relied on using this competitive bidding process. Sorry, I just had a bird that flew directly into the window next to my office, so that was a little bit startling. So, as in that piece as well, I'm not really focusing on complete privatization. Given the nature of public defense, it's funding through some level of government, be it, at the town level or county level or something like that. Public defense can never be completely privatized, as that would require exclusive private sector control over allocation of resources. And that's just not really going to happen. So again, what you see is that governments are going to use competitive bidding to procure a number of very different goods or services like road maintenance, infrastructure projects, and the like. And no matter what's being procured or purchased, bidding periods are usually initiated with the publication of a legal notice, soliciting bids by publication, usually in some sort of local newspaper. But what you see increasingly is that, the solicitation for these bids is happening online. And these requests for proposals are, they're more than just a simple vacancy announcement. They invite interested qualified parties to submit details regarding why they should be chosen to provide this service in question. So usually what you see in these RFPs that go out from these, from local governments is that they ask for a statement of, they provide a statement of what services are needed, a schedule for the project or the term of years for which a service is being solicited, qualifications needed for evaluation criteria, and a request for a budget. So those of you who are on the line who've ever done public defense work, you can imagine how difficult it might be to try to anticipate ahead of time, at least for a year or 2 years, what your entire budget is going to be. Sometimes you end up getting cases that you wouldn't expect to have happen. Perhaps you get a murder case, perhaps you get something else very technical where you need expert witnesses or, private investigation or something like that. How do you go about accounting for all that ahead of time, especially when you might be competing against other people? And especially when you suddenly start feeling this sort of pressure to undercut your potential competitors. This is something that you see happen a lot. And I think a lot of my colleagues who have done this work, have described to me this sort of pressure to try to undercut and to offer these lowball bids. Like, how exactly do I go about undercutting my competition? I'm going to bid less. So I've talked to people in places like Utah, Nevada, Arizona, who will do work like this for a town for $500 a month, $400 a month. And you see sort of this race to the bottom trying to, undercut each other and underbid each other. And then they're left in this sort of situation like, okay, now what? How do I go about cobbling a living even doing this? And having to devote a lot more of the time that they should be devoting to, their public defense caseload to perhaps their private work, their divorces, other things that can actually, pay the bills, property disputes, stuff like that. So that's a really big problem, I think, that we're looking at when it comes to self-dealing. That comes up using a procurement system like this. You end up feeling disincented to actually work for your public defense clients as hard as you should. You also feel a lot of a pressure to be as perhaps pleasing to everyone in your community, more than you might in a more anonymous sort of system, like in a bigger city. So what you see a lot of the time in a smaller town or in a smaller sort of criminal legal system is you might be showing up to court and dealing with the same prosecutor every single day. And, this prosecutor might even have some input as to whether your contract should be renewed or not. Are you necessarily going to want to fight as hard for your clients under that circumstance or not? Not necessarily. You don't want to rock the boat. You want to make sure you get your contract renewed every year. But really something that I am really trying to talk about in this paper that I think seems to have been the first time that's mentioned in the public defense context is talking about this concept with regard to, noble cause corruption. And, I was talking with someone else at the Deason Center who actually brought this to my attention. Like, have you thought about talking about noble cause corruption? I was like, oh, this is actually a really fascinating idea. So for those of you who aren't really too familiar with this concept, noble cause corruption, has been used as sort of this explanation as to why police might, might be prone to violence or violating people's rights and the like. And, it's sort of this ends justify the means sort of rationale, that police have these noble reasons for doing these things because they feel like they're actually doing the right thing. And they violate legal procedures for the sake of obtaining an outcome that they think is just. And I think that this has received a lot of pushback, especially recently, given some of the very grave, terrible things that police have done, I think with good reason. But I think that this is actually something that you see happen with public defenders who are operating under this sort of contract system, especially in the rural reaches of the country, because there is so much more in the way of that interrelatedness with your community. when you're living someplace small and working someplace small. And I think oftentimes what you see is that, while competitive bidding in the prosecution context often focuses, really clearly on a prospective contractor outbidding their competitors by offering the lowest monetary bid to local government, um, what you see is that in the rural context, if you're a public defender, oftentimes, those close relationships and historical dealings I think, are even more important and, might even more, how would you say, motivate you to do things that might not necessarily be the best thing for your client so much as the best thing for the community at large. Now, I know that there have been scholars out there who have said, perhaps this is something that public defenders should be doing, or defense attorneys generally. Perhaps they should be more concerned with what's best for the community at large. And, I think, from a normative perspective, we're just going to have to agree to disagree if, that's the way that you're coming at this, because I really do side with those who think that you really should have this undivided loyalty to your client in particular. And this is really hard in the rural setting because it's rife with that sort of interpersonal, interrelatedness that I think, gives rise to sort of potential for noble cause corruption. Another question, though, that I want to pose to all of you, though, is that I wanted to maybe start talking in this paper about, how would I say this, sort of professionalization period. In that, some of you who are joining might actually be, a rural public defender or might have had experience doing this. And something that I want to talk about potentially in this paper, and I'm not sure if it belongs in it or not, or perhaps in a separate paper, is looking at sort of the difficulties that one has being a public defender in an isolated place. And, sometimes I have people who tell me, well, what's the problem with doing this sort of contracting system? Large public defenders' offices do this, and they do a great job. And, something I was thinking about is, well, the difference in the rural space is that sometimes you're all alone if you're a public defender. You don't have anyone to have your back. You don't have anyone to sit down and, sort of share stories with or share ideas with necessarily as easily as you would if you were in a large, multi-attorney office. So, I think that there's an issue with regard to professionalization and being able to share ideas and being able to bounce around, ethical questions and the like, that I think is oftentimes really hard in the rural sort of public defender, scenario, I think. So this is something that I'm also thinking about in this paper. But, I worry that perhaps this sounds like a rather large mishmash of different ideas. And I'm hoping that at least presenting some of these to you, at least it makes sense, at least the thread that I'm trying to weave here, throughout the paper. But I'd be really interested in hearing some of your thoughts as to how I could refine this a bit more, interesting examples that you might have, or, any other leads that I should be following, because it's still very drafty. I still can take it lots of different places. So I think really getting your feedback will be especially helpful, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Maybell. That's so interesting. So folks who are in the audience, I'm going to be moderating. So please feel free to put up your hand or put a question in the chat. While we're waiting for the first folks to do that, I'm going to exercise the moderator's privilege.
For sure.
I'm sure too much to everybody's shock. And ask Maybell, I'm curious how you plan to distinguish between the ways that low bid contracts create these conflicts in rural and urban areas, and how you, I understand that it's a problem of scale. In fact, I think about it a lot that way myself, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder whether there are other features of rurality that you think contribute to making what I think is your central point, which is that the low bid contract model in rural communities is more problematic, not simply by degree, but maybe in kind. Is that right? That maybe they're qualitatively different rather than just in degree?
I think they are qualitatively different, actually. And I think that they are qualitatively different, especially given the geographic context specifically, which is where that sort of professionalization point that I'm trying to bring up at the end really comes in, because, someone did bring this up to me, like, well, what about, the, DC defender, system, they're all contract, or, the ones out in the Bronx. It's like, well, I do think it's very different when you're looking at this in the rural context, because again, usually you have maybe a solo attorney who's picking up the contract. You might have people who are the only public defense attorney, in 2 counties, 3 counties, 4 counties. So I think that that geographic piece is incredibly important. I'm not necessarily saying that all contract systems, for public defense is, categorically, going to fail or should never be used. I'm not even saying that necessarily in the rural context. But that I think in this specific, spatial reality,
Mhm.
but also, this sort of professionally isolated reality, that's when it ends up being a totally different thing.
So it sounds like you're talking about essentially a conflation of circumstances that make
Mhm.
contracts qualitatively different in rural areas, and I guess different not only in degree but in kind.
Exactly, I think so.
And I think
And
the reason I'm pushing
yeah,
you is because I do think that, I mean, you know the work as well as I do, that while those conflicts exist and that looking to judges and people who award contracts for favors, et cetera, but it sounds like part of your concern is this idea that you add that to the lack of support in terms of other practitioners, the lack of mentoring, the lack of training, and you begin to have kind of a snowball effect, is I think what I'm hearing you say.
I think so. And I think especially because, and I think in contrast to using this sort of contract system in, urban areas, there's also the problem, I think, in that a lot of folks who are working under these systems are also part-time.
Yes.
So there's, there's even more of a pull to go and work on stuff that's actually lucrative
Sure.
versus the stuff that pays, pretty minimally. Looking at one of the, Sixth Amendment Center's reports, I think out of Nevada, I believe, they sort of averaged it out where it's like, okay, each one of these cases, makes an attorney $20 a pop or something like that. It's like, yeah, I wouldn't want to put that much work into this either, frankly. And I think especially bringing in this piece that a lot of the time this is just part-time work as well, I think is really important.
Thanks. So I see Justin and then Eve. Justin, you were there first.
Maybell, this is such a cool project. I'm really happy for the chance to learn about more about your work on rurality and on public defense. I had a few interrelated questions. They have some overlap with what Pam was just asking you about, I think. One of them is sort of how much of this is about rurality and how much of this is specifically about low bid competitive contracts? And I know that is pretty much Pam's question, but I guess just to express it a different way, or I guess get at a different aspect of it, do you, or maybe others who are on the call, know of any models of public defense in rural areas that you like? And I think that if we could, I mean, I can think of a whole bunch of examples in urban centers. I used to work for one of them, that regularly get pointed to, but I actually can't think offhand of really effective, well put together indigent defense delivery systems in rural areas. That's not necessarily because they don't exist. It might just be because I'm ignorant about, the literature on rural criminal justice. But I think if you're able to identify a few well-functioning systems, it might help you to pinpoint what exactly is most objectionable and what's kind of secondary. And then I guess that the second question related to that is, you sounded a little shy, and I understand why, about kind of imposing your sense of kind of what a good public defender system ought to be on rural areas. And I guess I just wanted to push you a little bit on that. Like, if you are actually able, right? So maybe you just don't feel, maybe you just aren't confident yet that you have the right prescription, and so you're not feeling ready to impose it yet. But I guess I would just push you on, like, if you get to a point where you feel like you have identified some really valuable models that are demonstrably superior to these lowball contract models, why not say, yes, I am getting normative and I am saying you should do those instead, maybe even as a matter of constitutional law, as a matter of Gideon enforcement, or what have you. Anyways, looking forward to your thoughts on that.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And that's super helpful, and something that, I'm giving her a lot of props for actually organizing this event, back in October. But, Hannah Haxgard put together this amazing rural scholars workshop you know, with the University of South Dakota not too long ago, and I had the chance to actually talk to a few, you know, judges and rural practitioners actually on a panel that I was presenting on. And I'm, you know, I'm digging into learning more about North Dakota system actually. And it sounds like they've got a bit more of a centralized sort of, you know, using different public defense districts that are actually founded, not founded, but funded through some sort of centralized state agency, which I think is a really interesting way of approaching that. And that I think that there's a bit more, for lack of a better way of putting it, solidarity between all their attorneys, and a bit more, you know, sort of networking, and a bit more, you know, sort of a professionalized service that way. And what's nice is that they're also able to do this in sort of a full-time sort of, you know, on a full-time basis. So that's something I'm looking into more. Having spoken with a couple of attorneys from there, you know, of course they say the system's not perfect, you know, no system's ever going to be perfect. But I feel a bit more, you know, sanguine about that one the more I learn about it. So, you know, that might certainly be one to investigate and make, you know, interesting comparisons with, as to, you know, maybe this is something to take a look at and might be a bit more of an interesting model to crib from, for lack of a better way of putting it. But yes, you're right. I'm a bit shy to say, okay, this is the ideal system, because I don't know that any of us has actually come up with like the perfect system, you know, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least try to imagine what one would look like. Even when it comes to thinking of one that's hypothetical, that might be exceptionally helpful. So thank you.
So before I call on you, I just want to point out that a couple of people have put some suggestions in the chat.
Great.
And we'll put a link into a couple of programs that we've run, and you have the benefit of having some wonderful public defenders and public defense system managers on this call, who I'm sure will be able to help you out with a lot of this, because as you point out, there are lots of very diverse systems, and it depends in part, right, on how they get funded.
Thank you so much.
Take it away.
Hi, great. Yeah, thank you, Maybell. It's so great to hear you present. I was really excited when this came across my email, and and thanks to the Deason Center as well for hosting. So I'm here in Nevada, in Las Vegas, and I noted, like in my notes as you were talking, metrics, you know, and I completely agree. It's so hard to have a system of metrics in place, and that interacts with the competitive bidding in such a way that the metrics that cause people to get contracts are bidding low or getting along with people, popularity, whatever it is. But I wonder the extent to which you want to engage with whether or not, you know, one possibility is to change the bidding structure or not have bidding, but another is to have a system of metrics that are independent and independently enforced. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, that's the direction that Nevada has really made some progress in, even before the ACLU lawsuit that you mentioned, creating the Department of Indigent Defense, which has just promulgated regulations. They are having a training today. And so they're trying to both do oversight and make sure that rural defenders live up to the standards of zealous representation, and also provide the training and some of that peer and mentorship support that you mentioned rural defenders often don't have. So I just would be interested in your thoughts about that, and whether, you know, I think a piece of that might be the power that they have. You know, do they have the power to make sure that somebody who doesn't live up to the metrics of excellence, or at least competence, you know, is removed from their post? That's a question as well. So thank you. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on the ACLU lawsuit as well.
You know, and I think this is a really, you know, that's a really great question. And, you know, I appreciate you pointing out what the Department of Indigent Defense is doing. And that's certainly something that I'll have to go take a look at. And I've been thinking about this question of metrics and trying to figure out, you know, how do we go about at least establishing some sort of standard that you can point out, rather than, okay, let's underbid each other and everything. And I think this is actually something that perhaps, you know, this is going to sound really, I guess, cynical. But sometimes, you know, especially when I was practicing in the rural reaches in Utah, people felt so far away from, you know, Salt Lake, or even from their state bar generally. And, you know, like, why do we even pay these dues? Who cares? It's not like they care about us out here in like the sticks in like Randolph, or, you know, Washington County or something like that. And I really think that this is something where state bars could actually start stepping up and providing some sort of leadership when it comes to, well, maybe these are things that we should consider. Maybe these are standardized metrics. Maybe this should actually be a set rate that we should be looking at when we're doing these contracts or something like that. So I think, perhaps there might be, a place for them to even start, taking over when it comes to looking at what metrics we should be considering, including the metric of like, okay, this is what, a livable wage might be or something like that. So that I think is really a potentially, exciting place for state bars to start looking, and start, actually getting involved in this sort of process and in this sort of issue. And, Nevada and Utah, I think, have a lot of similarities, which is why you brought up the Nevada situation to my attention, actually earlier in the summer when I very, very barely presented like a not 2-page, but 2-paragraph abstract, and, it's interesting having seen it, seeing it wend its way a bit more successfully than Utah's has been. And, I have to wonder like what exactly is so much more, why is it so much more successful than, some other states have been? And I really got to dig into that a bit more and like, read a bit more about it. But, I do appreciate you having brought that up because I wasn't aware of it even until this past summer. But thank you. Do you know specifically what the Department of Indigent Defense is looking at, like when it comes to what metrics they've been proposing or anything? I'm just curious.
So I'm in the process of learning all this too right now.
I was just curious.
And yeah, so I'm not, but mostly they have, they're using the ABA standards, and they're trying to a large extent, I think the template is based on the ABA standards, and I'm forgetting the official title of that for defense, for public defense or criminal defense. And they just promulgated regulations this year, and are starting trainings as well. So they've got a lot on their website. There's a commission as well. And so the process here, and maybe it's the same in other states often, is that our Nevada Supreme Court sets up a commission. The commission looks at it, makes recommendations, that ends up, going down the line and eventually leading to legislation. So I had in a previous essay that I wrote argued for statewide public defenders as really being the only way to maintain quality and culture. But here I am, and I'm seeing this like alternative way, which is just an experiment, which is just really getting off the ground here in Nevada, which is if you have rural jurisdictions which really want to maintain their own identity and their own needs and don't necessarily go for the idea of the statewide agency so much as a county controlled way of looking at defense, then can you have a statewide agency though that at least is ensuring that both resources and oversight occur so that rural defendants get at least as good representation as urban defendants do.
Fantastic, thank you. And I have to wonder, like, and I'm just opening this up to everyone too, like, are there sort of different interventions that you think might work in different parts of the country? Because this is something that one of my NIU colleagues brought up, where he was like, you make this point in your paper that, rurality and rural spaces, they're very diverse in, culture and history and everything. So might some interventions be more palatable depending on the state versus others, just culturally, I wonder. And that's something that I've been chewing over too. Like, might some metrics be more acceptable versus others in Vermont versus Nevada versus Arizona or something like that. So, that's something that, I've started chewing over too, in relation to what you were talking about as well. So thank you so much.
So Maybell, can I just piggyback on what you've just said and I guess make one observation and one suggestion?
For sure.
My observation is that the tension, right, in trying to regulate what you're describing, there really are sort of these two different competing tensions. One is the quality question, but the other is the regulatory structure that it forces it. And the reality is, I suspect, but maybe I'm wrong, that one size won't fit all, not as a matter of culture, right, but as a matter of state law. And so if you look at places, for example, you look at what happened in Louisiana, there's a statewide regulatory body, but, a statute that adopts the 10 principles as, kind of the gold standard, but really is highly deferential to local norms. Texas is highly decentralized versus someplace that's top down, right? System. You're going to have you're going to have different options from a regulatory perspective, right? And I wonder if you have thought about which funding models are most appropriate to regulate the contracts that you think should exist, bearing in mind that there are two ways to think about public defender structures, right? There's the question of regulation and there's a question of funding. So if you look at the Sixth Amendment Center's website, they talk about state versus local public defender systems based, I think David's system is largely based on governance, regulatory authority. You also look at it based on the question of who funds the system. And you know, most systems these days take a good chunk of their budget out of counties. And that creates a different paradigm for your problem. And I think suggests that there might be different solutions. I don't know which is the regulatory structure that might be of more interest to you, how things get funded or who is technically in charge of them. Sometimes they're hard to take apart.
It's pieces from each other. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, you know, that question almost feels like it collapses on it, you know, on each other. But yeah, I think that really this question of like following the money would be a really interesting way of approaching this too. And, you know, I've been talking with a reporter out in Pennsylvania who's actually, you know, doing sort of this project where she's trying to follow the funding for actually like small municipal courts out in Pennsylvania with part-time, you know, justice of the peace court, or I forget what they call them out there because Pennsylvania, they have like a weird title for them, with their, you know, local judges. And, you know, I think that's a really interesting approach. And that's certainly what, you know, what I intend the next piece of this to be too, would be, you know, looking at judges, you know, who are part-time as well. But yeah, I think actually following the money, trying to figure out, okay, where does the funding come from, is a really important part of this. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that that's a good way to structure it.
Which leads me to my question, which is who are the primary people awarding these contracts? Because my appreciation is that in some jurisdictions, it is the state authority. Wisconsin would be a good example, right? Where the state has a responsibility for providing all public defense, the state agency. And in some places, I think it's the municipal or the county authority and the county government that does it. Does that make a difference to your understanding of the propriety of the contracts and the best way to regulate them?
It does. You know, I think especially in those places where you see, you know, the town or the county or something like that, I think a lot of the relationships are quite a bit more. I don't want to put this in such like a, you know, sort of negative sounding way, because sometimes, you know, these close relationships are a good thing, but sort of is sort of like incestual sort of way where it's like everyone knows each other and there's, you know, everyone's all up in each other's business, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I think that that really undercuts, you know, the propriety of those contracts, like you were saying, a lot more than if you have this sort of centralized, you know, state agency that awards them, like you were talking about in Wisconsin. You know, for example, you know, this example that I was talking about out in Utah, because the prosecution's office is also part-time and small, the prosecutor's office also provides advice with regard to civil contracts and everything. And, you know, so they're like, okay, you should hire this person because we like them better. And I think that that's something that could occur a lot more when you're looking at everything being controlled, you know, at the sort of granular local level, even if it's not necessarily like official, you know, everyone gets together and, you know, eats lunch together and kind of raps about what's happening. That's much more likely than if you have a much more centralized sort of state system determining who should be awarded each of these contracts. So I think that that's a really big problem when you have it much more localized that way.
Thanks. Eve, is your hand still up or did you just not take it? Remember to take it? I know it's the Zoom thing. I just wanted to make sure because I'm trying to be thoughtful about who wants to ask a question next. Maybell, you've got a lot of comments and part of my job is supposed to be moderating not just the questions, but the comments. So let me just draw your attention.
Great, by the way. I'm looking through the comments and they are so helpful. So I'm grateful to everyone providing links and examples and everything. This is so valuable.
Well, so I want to ask you about a question that's come up, or I guess I'll read it for the group in case people haven't found the chat. You know, Andy Davis has just suggested, you know, that really there are 3 papers here. And I think he may be right, because you wanted 3 papers, right? Instead of just one.
Oh, always, right?
But, you know, he's suggesting there's really the question about, you know, the problems and benefits of lawyering in small communities, which would exist whether it was a low bid contract or not, right? The intimacy you're describing, the courthouse working group problem, et cetera. Then contracting as a policy or service delivery choice would be, I think he's listed as number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then bidding itself and the process of contract bidding. And it's sort of, and it may be, I don't know, but it may be that those are 3 different ways of conceptualizing this problem, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I really think so. And I think that I appreciate Andy giving those suggestions and that sort of structure in that. My inclination whenever I start working on a project is taking this giant ball of wax and trying to like swallow it whole somehow. So really suggestions with regard to how to approach the problem in more manageable, chunks that you can actually sink your teeth into are always very, very helpful. So I think that those are fantastic suggestions. And certainly
Could I jump off it? Actually, sorry to interrupt, but
No.
Maybell, I because all I did was like actually just try and that was really a note where I was trying to actually sort out the thoughts that you had already provided and just sort of put them into boxes. So
No. That's so helpful. And I have a hard time doing that myself because it's like, yeah, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's like I always have like all these multiple thought bubbles. And for me, sometimes the challenge is how do I organize this into like nice little boxes? So thank you. This is awesome.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there really are like a lot of sort of different interesting things going on. And even I really appreciate what other people are saying. I'm absorbing the thoughts about metrics. Things are going in kind of different directions here. One thing I guess that I've just been sort of wondering about is like, what is the best case scenario in your mind for a contract? Because you've alluded to the fact that like maybe sometimes it's sort of healthy or at least beneficial to have folks in a community know one another, although there may be pros and cons. So what is the best case scenario of a contractor operating in one of these rural places? And I ask, maybe slightly coming out of the experience of recently having interviewed somebody in a Texas county. This is a Texas county which established a public defender office and did so to replace its prior contracting system. So it had what it called a public defender, but it's actually contracted and replaced it with a government employee type one. And sometimes when you're in these counties, you do come across, as I did in this case, folks that just seem like they are down in the trenches in some unregarded place doing unregarded work and really trying their best, and they made this decision at that point to move away from the contract and but there's no particular implication the contract had been doing a bad job. So is there some version of this where if you had to push it all the way to the extreme where you could say this is like a great looking contracting system, I can see it working well, even when you conceptualize that, is there any circumstance where you have no reservations about it, where you're like, or are you able to get on board and think this could work, or are you still thinking, but you know what, it just has this latent potential for corruption of a noble or ignoble kind, and I just can't quite get on board?
I mean, that's a thing, that I want to clarify, where I'm not even necessarily saying that this is always the worst choice. I want to make that clear because, I think a lot of people have written, interesting scholarship with regard to why it might be bad to, have elections for positions like these, or using an appointment system otherwise, or something like that. So I can see reasons why you'd want to use this system. It's more just trying to make everyone aware of the actual risks in doing so. When it comes to actually trying to make it such that I actually feel okay about it, I think, a very basic thing for me is guaranteeing that, someone would be able to do this job in some sort of full-time capacity. So, that might require some centralization of some of these services where it's like, okay, maybe you have a public defender or public defender's office, who does this full-time, so they're not distracted by their other caseload, working on things that actually make them money. So they're actually have more undivided loyalties to the job that they're doing. I think would be really helpful. Something with regard to establishing some sort of minimum rate at which, for lack of a better way of putting it, getting every one of these rural attorneys to sort of unionize, and demand, okay, we should all at least be making this amount of money per hour. And we don't go below this figure, would make me feel a bit better. And I think that might be an interesting part where, an interesting point at which, state bars could actually maybe step in and provide some sort of leadership with regard to like a model basic contract or something like that, might be helpful. But I think each one of these systems, I anticipate, if you use appointments or even with, an ideal contract, there's going to always be some sort of problem in that realistically, there might not be as much money as you hope for, something like that. But I think, there could be some really interesting tweaks to make it a bit more palatable to me. But I don't know necessarily about making it perfect. And I think this gets back to the question that Justin was asking earlier. What would your perfect system look like? And, I still feel a little bit coy about that because it's like, I always find problems with something, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, no matter what system I think of. But I think that, perhaps having, a bit more centralization, and actually figuring out, okay, what's a minimal hourly rate might be really helpful. But, I'm just sort of winging it when thinking of this right now, like offhand, because I'm sure I'll think of something wrong with those suggestions too in a little bit. But yeah.
We have someone on the call who actually, if Scott's still available, TIDC is doing something in Texas that might be of interest. I know you mentioned mentoring, and Scott's graciously agreed to be tapped in.
Oh, great.
A little bit about this it's a very exciting initiative that's going on here in Texas to deal with some of the problems you talked about.
Amazing.
It just occurred to me that it might be of interest to you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Professor Metzger, and thanks for letting me chime in. I apologize. I was pulled away during the middle of this, so I missed a lot of the presentation, but I can talk about our mentorship program. It's called the Future Indigent Defense Leaders program, and we have had 2 classes thus far made up of 25 mentors and 25 mentees from across Texas. And what's involved in terms of the program is, and we've tried to spread it out across the state. So, Texas is a very big place. 50 mentees, across Texas is, in the scheme of things, not that many, but I think we view this as a way in which culture can be changed. And we believe that, it's one of those things, you train somebody up, give them good skills, then, they can pass that along to somebody else. And, it just, it keeps going and going from there, hopefully. And, we're hoping to expand it and, maybe get other counties to, try to, set up their own mentorship program. In fact, this program was modeled on a program that we started when I was working at the Public Defender's Office in Harris County. We got a federal grant to start the Future Appointed Counsel Training Program, the FACT program. And so this larger statewide effort is based on that initial local program out of Harris County. But, we like I said, we've got 2 classes of 25 mentors and mentees. And the goal was to send them to Gideon's Promise as part of a training component. And so they have training through Gideon's Promise, and they go through that Core 101 program, which is a 3-year program, probably the best, training, there is in the country. They have mentors through Gideon's Promise, but we also hook them up with local mentors as well. And we have been doing, during COVID, unfortunately, that second class could not go to Gideon's Promise. So they should be doing that next summer. We're not going to be doing a 3rd class, at least initially, because of all the uncertainty created by COVID. Yeah. But nonetheless, I think it's been a success thus far. Has created networks throughout the state, and what more can I say besides that? And we're trying to spread it out between urbans and rurals, but rural, admittedly, it's been tough to create those networks in rural parts of the state because, there's just not that many lawyers in rural parts of Texas and the rest of the United States, and there's not many young new lawyers going there. So the one thing that we are trying to do is set up more public defender offices in rural parts of Texas because we think that's a good incentive, a stable, salary for young lawyers to go, and it's an incentive to go to rural parts of the state.
Well, that's really exciting, Scott. And I hope you don't mind me catching up with you and maybe sending you a few emails later just to learn even more about this program and everything.
Sure.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
So I'm gonna open it back up again. We have a bunch of people I know who had to jump off right at 4, but we do have till 4:15. And I've got a chat that I think was supposed to go to the group, but came to me. And it was a question about your methods that you had mentioned speaking to people in several states. Can you tell us more about your interviews?
And that's something that I need to learn more about, and having to kind of build more skills and doing more standardized interviews, I think will be something that is really helpful. And that a lot of this I have this sort of intuitive sense as to what's going on from having just sat down and spoken on the phone with just lots of public defenders that I've gotten to connect with through things like, the Deason Center, or, for my own practice, or, people who know people who are like, well, you want to talk to this person about their contract or something like that. And that's been really helpful. Some of the difficulty I've run into, and maybe this is something that people might have suggestions about, is getting people to actually talk on the record because they're really terrified of doing so, and they're worried about endangering their contract. And that's something that has been really hard. So I don't know if anyone has any suggestions with regard to how to broach that, because actually sitting down and trying to get people to do a more formalized interview where it's like, well, can I actually, quote you on this is really difficult. Andy mentions, promise confidentiality and go through IRB. I think that's something that's really important to do. But, I think this is sort of pushing my sort of very beginner skills when it comes to actually doing ethnographic research. And, I think to some extent what I need to do in future is perhaps actually have a separate paper devoted to sort of these talks I've had with people and sort of their own experiences in dealing with the system in particular, I think would be really helpful.
That's great. There's a terrific book that John Gould did with Maya Barak a few years ago about capital defenders, and it's based on interviews with 80 capital defenders.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think about reaching out to John at some point, who's now at ASU.
Great.
About his methodology, because I know that they did, capital interviews are obviously very hard to do, and the confidentiality is very difficult to maintain, because once you start talking about case specifics, there's very little that isn't traceable.
Mm-hmm.
That might be I will be happy to set up an email that introducing you guys, but that book might be a nice model for thinking about interviews. I'm trying to remember, it's called Capital Defense: Inside the Lives of America's Death Penalty Lawyers, is my recollection.
Great.
Something like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I will definitely track that down. So, okay, John Gould at ASU. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to give other people's help. So let me ask, we have a couple of folks, I think Joanna Landau may have jumped off, but I know we have a couple of folks here who are living and working in rural communities. I don't know if they were able to stay that long, but we'll make sure to give you the list, Maybell, of who's on the call.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So that they can potentially be a resource for you.
Great.
The other thing I guess I would suggest, and I don't know if folks in the webinar have any ideas about this, is I wonder if there's anyone who has kind of a comprehensive index of the different systems that are used to provide rural public defense. In other words, is there a benchmark? Do we have any idea? I don't.
I haven't seen anything like that out there. And if someone has one, that I would be infinitely grateful to you.
I think we have them state by state, but I don't know that anyone's done sort of a national compilation. So come think of it like its own new project. So there's a fourth one for you, Maybell.
Woo, yes.
All right, well, folks, we are approaching the witching hour, and I do try very hard to keep us right at the limit. Maybell, is there anything else that we can tell you or folks on this call can help you with? Because this is such an interesting paper, and I got to tell you, you've gotten a tremendous turnout. I don't know if you've been able to see the folks you've drawn, but a really great mix of professors and researchers and practitioners. Some people who managed to do all three.
I am tremendously grateful to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and your fabulous feedback. Both just live and also in the chat, because I've also been following the chat box as well. I'm hoping that at least in the coming months, I'll actually have something that's a bit more solid as an actual paper to give folks to read over. So if some of you might be interested in taking a look at a draft, I would be super, super grateful, because I would love to get as much feedback as I can on that draft. Usually I write about prosecutors. So, this is a little bit of a new foray for me into writing about defense. So any of the help that I could get from you all in future would be super welcome. And I would be very, very grateful.
All right, well, folks, if you want more information about how to reach Maybell, for now, she's at NIU. Pretty soon she'll be at Tulane. And if you don't know how to reach her there, you can reach her through us. I want to thank everybody again for joining us. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, it's not just that this topic is near and dear to our hearts, but so is Maybell. She has been a big piece of our rural criminal justice efforts. She is, as many of you know, wildly engaged with the legal community across the country, organizing symposia, a podcast, taking on all kinds of but it's important, taking on all kinds of very exciting initiatives. And it's a pleasure to be able to give something back to her. And so we're so grateful to have been able to host. And thank you everybody for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thank you everyone. And thank you, Pam.
Our pleasure. Bye everybody.